All right, welcome everyone. Let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us for New Energy Conversations with Early Career Energy Researchers. My name is Megan, and I am the Manager of Academic Initiatives at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. And I'm excited to welcome everyone here today for this is the final talk of our winter season of the series. So for folks who are joining us for this for the first time, I'll just give you a quick bit of background on our New Energy Initiative. So the goal of the New Energy program is to connect, empower, and raise the profile of early stage researchers in energy and climate. And one way that we do this is through this New Energy series webinar. And this started during the pandemic as a way to help early career researchers continue to be able to share their work at a time when people couldn't go to conferences and things like that. But it's continued since, and we've hosted over 50 emerging scholars who've been able to share their work through the series. We also host an annual in-person New Energy Summer Summit, which our speaker today attended last year. And the summit aims to increase the capacity of early stage energy and climate researchers to accelerate transitions to equitable and sustainable energy systems and a healthy climate via interdisciplinary scholarship and collaboration. And applications are open right now for our third annual summit. So please feel free to reach out to us or check out our website if you are an advanced PhD student, postdoc, or assistant professor, and you're interested in applying to that. And I'll share a QR code for that at the end of the webinar. And then just one more quick note before we get started. After the talk today, we'll have an opportunity for discussion. So feel free to enter your questions for our speaker using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can do that at any time during the program, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can after the presentation. All right, so with all that out of the way, I am delighted to kick us off today by introducing our moderator for the session. We're very happy to have Professor Vikrant Vaid here. He is the Stata Family Career Development Associate Professor of Engineering and the Program Area Lead of Mechanical Operations and Systems Engineering here at Dartmouth College. And he also serves as the Faculty Director of the Masters of Engineering Management program at the Thayer School of Engineering. His research and teaching focus on operations research applied to transportation, climate, and healthcare systems. And he's a recipient of the NSF Career Award, numerous Best Paper Awards, and an Excellence in Teaching Award. He holds a BS from IIT Bombay, an MS in Transportation, and another MS in Operations Research, both from MIT, and his PhD is in Systems, also from MIT. And he has been on the Dartmouth faculty since 2014 and has prior industry work experience in energy, healthcare, and the finance sectors. Welcome, Professor Vaid. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Megan. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this very interesting talk that I'm really looking forward to. And the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to introduce our speaker, Benedict Veraga. So Benedict, or Ben, is a graduate research assistant at the George Washington University. He's doing his PhD in electrical engineering with a focus on power and energy systems for smart cities. He applies optimization and machine learning techniques to solve energy scheduling problems for cities with diverse energy generation and storage portfolios. He received his BSc and MSc in electrical engineering, also from George Washington University, both with concentrations in energy and power systems as well. Before initiating his PhD studies, Ben worked at an engineering consulting firm, Strategic Analysis Incorporated, aiding the development of techno-economic analyses for clean energy technologies. We are delighted to have him give this talk as part of this series. Please join me in welcoming Ben Veraga.
Thank you, Professor Vaid. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you, Megan and Amanda, for this opportunity, but also from the New Energy Summit last year. It was such a great experience. So anyone out there listening, I highly recommend you apply or share it with your network. So I'll get started with my presentation. There's a longer title that was on the webinar, but I'll hopefully work up to what the subtitle was. For now, the climate adaptation and mitigation clash is what I want to spend some time focusing on. The idea that there's climate adaptation and climate mitigation strategies. And based off of my 4 years of PhD research, I'm trying to see or find some possible clashes within adapting to climate change or mitigating possible climate change. So this all started for me in New York City. I have, I guess it's a superhero origin story or a villain origin story, whatever you'd like to pin me as. But for me, it's this moment in New York City where I grew up in Spain and I had family in Mexico. So I'd have part of my family in Spain complaining about some high energy prices, electricity prices because of the government's actions or whatever. And then family in Mexico complaining about some of the air quality problems because of lack of regulation with clean air, clean water, unlike the States. So I grew up hearing these kind of different stories, and my family members would always talk about the States, America, as this place where everything's so much better as far as energy. And this was my first time in New York City. I was 7 years old. And it was actually the same year where the New York City or Northeast blackout happened. So there I was thinking, what a great place that I'm going to discover and explore. Everyone talks so much better about it. But here, this unprecedented blackout happened in the city that never sleeps. So I started to think you have to have some sort of reliable system, affordable and clean, thinking of all the different perspectives that my family members and I had been hearing about clean air, affordable energy prices, and reliable to extreme weather or blackouts. So really my question started to become, who's deciding this kind of balance? Because clearly I had been in different countries. Clearly there's differences in how much of each a country can provide to its citizens. So this inspired me to do engineering, and now here I am, 4th year of a PhD program, and I'm starting to understand that there are, in fact, differences and trade-offs in between these different categories that we hope we can meet. Recently, you can see the infrastructure deal having all these bubbles, whether it's clean energy jobs, so the economic, the environmental, and then strengthening resilience. So within this energy transition, there's this clear dialogue and segmentation of affordability, cleanliness, and reliability. Then, of course, during my studies, I could see in the news whether it's the California fires being attributed partly to PG&E equipment, or the Texas grid not being or being able to handle a winter freeze, and similar, the power lines in Hawaii attributing that to possible cascading problems during their fires. This is all not to mention any political leaning or differences between these places. It's only to say that there are clear energy-related, environment-related interactions that beg the question of how reliable, how affordable, how sustainable should these systems be? Because people in Texas, I'm sure, didn't complain for years about the cheaper energy prices, but then the freeze occurred. So I, as an engineer, have been trying to see what kind of frameworks and information to base my studies off of. The IPCC, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, is one of my good sources of inspiration, but also information. They have this kind of table in the more recent reports where I want you to focus on this idea that climate response and adaptations is one dimension and mitigation is another dimension. What they mean by that is, let's mitigate future climate problems by lowering emissions. And let's also respond to this climate change, which results in severe storms, severe heat or cold. So let's have different adaptation processes or technologies so that we aren't so vulnerable to those. So the idea that in this case, with this example, they say one kind of category, resilient power systems, can give you so much in mitigation or so much in adaptation. And this, to me, started to frame this question about, is there a clash between mitigating and adapting when you're making energy transition decisions? Another big influence for me, since it all started in the city, was the role cities play in this energy transition. And it's clear from UN or International Renewable Energy Agency reporting that they play a big role in the transition. Most people will be living in cities, and making them sustainable and reliable, mitigating and adapting to climate change is one of the focuses. So this kind of, as a PhD student, I spent some years learning about this, and then I started to frame my question around what is the impact of incorporating renewable and storage technologies in urban energy systems. Because in my mind, I was thinking, okay, renewable energy generation will give you mitigation, and storage will be great for adapting to these extreme weather events. So I started to think, if you have the power grid, a boiler, and chillers, this is a classic way of serving district energy. So you have a bunch of buildings, it could be a hospital or campus, offices. You have typically one bigger plant of boilers and chillers that are providing all the hot and cold necessities to these buildings. You also have a utility input where you could get electricity from the grid to run all sorts of daily operations. So a CHP plant is typical in cities as well, when you have use of heat on site. So you're generating electricity with a CHP plant, and you're using that extra thermal energy to provide space heating or hot water to the buildings. Now this, as far as adapting, is a very good technology, because when there's a climate event and your power line is cut off to the city, you want to have some way of generating electricity on site. And I will say that just the technology of a turbine, of a gas turbine, is not unsustainable in itself. It's the kind of fuel you put in the turbine that could be unsustainable. So the technologies, as far as us considering different alternatives and methods of reaching these sustainability goals, turbines and burning things themselves are not unsustainable. It's making sure that the supply chain and the emissions are controlled. So this is a key technology to consider when adapting, especially adapting to climate change. And then we've talked about solar, batteries, solar water heaters, hot water tank, cold water tank, and an absorption chiller, which is a way of taking hot and turning it into cooling. So what I'm painting here is a picture of, I have all these different technology options, and technically, if I go back, this is what it would look like today. Some more fancy urban energy systems have a CHP plant, but they don't have any other technologies that we're trying to consider. And if we are going to go through this energy transition and try to adapt and mitigate the climate change, the question is, how do these different technologies impact the ability for this energy system to mitigate or adapt to climate change? So the impact we can measure in cost, that's typical, but also we could run some scenarios where there's outages. We could also calculate the emissions or the fuel efficiency of taking this natural gas or whatever gas we do in the future and burning it in an efficient way. So to do this as an electrical engineer, you create a model. So you create a model that mimics the operation of the district energy system throughout seasons and years with different technologies under different operating conditions. So to do this, you have to define objectives and constraints. If any of you out there are engineers or systems engineers, this is typical, like your bread and butter, but I will keep it at a high level just so that I can explain what's accounted for, but not necessarily how to do the math of this. You have objectives like minimizing operating costs or minimizing emissions. You also have constraints that are system-wide or technology specific. So within the technologies, you can take the power grid and say, well, my power grid can only provide this much power and this much sell back ability. Some grids will allow you to sell back to the grid, others won't, but this would be some sort of boundary that I can or cannot violate. Then solar, this would be related to the available solar energy that's throughout the day. That's something that has to be bounded. Batteries, you have your ability to discharge and charge and the capacity. And then there's also losses that occur if you're not using that energy. The CHP plant has different ways of ramping up and ramping down, and there is a dependency between producing electricity and producing thermal energy. So that's this heat and power operating region, which typically means that if you want to produce heat or want to produce power, there's an associated region that you have to be in for it to be physically possible by the CHP system. Then similar to a battery, you can model a thermal hot water storage tank the same way. Boilers, solar water heaters have similarities to PV and the grid. And then on the cooling side, same idea, you have these different technologies with different boundaries. All of these are mathematical expressions for building this model, but it is all obviously rooted in the reality of these technologies. So you're just trying to account for as many of these realities as possible so that when you do run the model, you're getting realistic results. So this is at the technology level. At the system level, you're trying to meet your demands. And that would be for electricity, for space heating or hot water, and for cooling, space cooling. Of course, during the summer, you'll have more cooling. During the winter, you'll have more heating. But this is something that has to be always met. And you could have a critical electrical load, let's say for the hospital, or the typical electrical load. But this would be the system-wide constraints. Then for objectives, this is the only time I'll put some math, but I'll explain it. It is important to know that when you do buy from the grid, you have an energy charge, which is just how much did you buy. And then you have a demand charge, which is how big the path has to be for you to receive that. The best analogy is energy charge is how much water volume you were asking for, and demand charge is how big the spigot has to be. How big does the output have to be? These are two different ways of charging, and this is typical for cities and really any power utility that's serving larger buildings, because they do need to give you some sort of penalty for pulling a lot and then not pulling. It's very different for them and their equipment. So the idea that you have energy charge and demand charge is a typical way of modeling the costs. Then this would be a way of showing the area under the power and time curve is your energy charge, and the peak point that you're pulling is your demand charge. Then natural gas has another expression for boilers and CHP plants burning natural gas. You don't get everything that you're burning. There is an efficiency associated with combusting natural gas. So you have to account for that in the objective function of minimizing cost. Similarly, for emissions, you'd have an emission factor. The grid is generating emissions elsewhere, so you do need to know what those are at any time. And the natural gas has a certain amount of CO2 that is emitted when you combust that. So these are the emission expressions. All of that to say that you've now been able to build a mathematical representation of all these technologies, their associated costs, and their associated emissions. When you have this model, you can now give it parameters. So you would choose regional, technological, and economic parameters to fill in these mathematical expressions, and then you start to get some results. I'll just mention that within parameter selection, using data sets, available data sets, Department of Energy, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, a lot of these great national labs or government organizations have provided this kind of information. So it makes it a little easier to, for example, take their their typical large office electricity, steam, or chilled water demand. They'll give you this kind of a typical large office does this. So I can say I'm serving this many buildings, 7 large offices, 2 supermarkets, and all these other ones. And this is the kind of electricity they demand in the winter or in the summer. Similarly, in the winter, this is how much steam they're demanding and how much steam they're demanding in the summer. All of this is from good resources, luckily available, and same for renewable energy. There's plenty of other resources that you can say, how much would my solar panel produce in a summer day or a winter day? Of course, less in the winter, more in the summer, but that is all available. Solar water heaters have the same behavior. I won't go into these other ways of selecting parameters. They do come down to different like manufacturers. If I want to use a boiler or a CHP plant, realistically, I could reach out to a manufacturer and ask, what kind of efficiencies do you have? What kind of boundaries do you have to operate within? But all of this has been gathered over the years, and I'm happy to share this with anyone who wants to reach out. Utility prices, same thing. There's my regional ones, but of course, anyone where you might be, you could see a utility bill and you'll find all these parameters. So all that to say, you end up getting a per technology, who is doing what at what time. So you're moving through your days, you're trying like 3 a.m., 4 a.m., you're reaching the morning peak for heating, for electricity, for cooling. So what technologies are playing in the mix? And of course, you could have the CHP plant keep its constant power output. The grid might be the one that's going up and down, and the solar and battery are maybe playing to shave some of these last little peaks so that you don't have that expensive of a utility bill. This isn't showing any exact results as much as it's showing the idea that these different technologies will be playing together to fulfill these loads, to meet these loads, always respecting as much as you can. But then the question started to become, how can I say affordable, clean, reliable? How can I benchmark these in different ways? Sure, I can get these different outputs and say, oh, it's great. When I'm minimizing costs, my battery is doing a great job. But really, what does that mean for affordability? So cost, emissions, performance becomes a little more of the technical dialogue. And within that, there's different metrics. So energy cost, return on investment, net present value, internal rate of return, all of these are, once I make the energy investment to get a solar panel, what kind of return could I expect? For performance, I can say my fuel efficiency, I can say my load factor, which is how much I'm leaning on the grid, or I could do outage related metrics, reliability, vulnerability, resiliency. All these can be defined in different ways, but for the most part, you're trying to comment on your ability to withstand some storm or some outage. And then emissions, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, these are typically the three that the EPA is always keeping an eye out and have plenty of information that can let us model these. So with that being said, you say, let me run different scenarios. So in this case, 19 different scenarios. For half of them, you can buy and not sell to the grid. For the other half, you can buy and you can sell to the grid. And then you add solar, you add battery, you add solar and battery, you add an absorption chiller, you add a solar water heater, as many configurations as you want. You could go wild with this. You could try all of the possible permutations, but the point is to try to get an idea of, as I vary these technologies and the ability to sell to the grid, what kind of results in these departments am I getting? So this would be for all 19, my fuel efficiency, my outage, vulnerability, resiliency, reliability. I also have my cost metrics, return on investment or energy costs, and I have my emissions, methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide. So all of these are the same color bubbles, essentially. I'm saying I have my performance table, my cost table, and my emissions table. When you put them all together just to get a snapshot of all different like performance, cost, and emissions side by side, this is where I started to notice some of these differences. So if I focus just on adding thermal storage, so a hot water tank and a cold water tank, I have by far the best return on investment. So the finance person would say, definitely go with your hot water and ice storage tank. But the environmentalist would say, you're not really lowering your emissions compared to the base case. Someone would say you could still have a decent return on investment with solar, and you would definitely lower your emissions. But then someone who's worried about outages and climate adaptation would say, yeah, but you are worse at an outage vulnerability than if you had storage technologies. So this isn't meant to be any concluding results on a specific case study. This is just generic numbers, generic loads, starting to reveal that there is some trade-off between having a very cost-effective decision, between that being cost-effective and that being minimizing of emissions or maximizing of reliability. These are, in some sense, clashing, where one decision is not going to give you the best emission reduction and the most reliable performance. And this is why the subtitle starts to be a little more clear. I'll hopefully be fully clear by the end, but a trade-off analysis between efficiency, cost, and emissions, for my focus being a Northeast urban energy system that incorporates distributed energy resources. So as I incorporate these distributed energy resources, I want to answer the question, what are these trade-offs in between being really cost-effective or lowering my emissions? All of this has become, because it was a Department of Energy project, it made its way into a little graphical user interface. It's available. If you want to try it out, you would select your energy system, your city energy system, which would have different ways of sizing technologies, different ways of sizing storage, and then you would simulate different operations. So you would say minimizing cost on a normal day in January. This is what it would look like. On the left, you'd have before you installed technologies, and on the right, you installed a big battery and you got 3% better hourly cost savings. Side by side, you could see before and after. That could also be seen in different ways. You could see how much does that affect the way my utility bill would look before and after. But really, you can do not just operational costs, you could do emissions and get the same kind of before and after with emissions. At the bottom, you have the long-term study. So over the lifetime of the system, it goes back to reporting these different tables: performance, cost, and sustainability. again, to get a full picture of what's happening when you make these decisions. So the idea here is that I can tell you the impact that these renewable and storage technologies are having on the energy system, but can I find the actual trade-offs between them? So if I go back to this little user interface, I say, okay, minimize costs with all these technologies. And it tells me this is my minimum cost. It's for a big city, so this much per day. I also say same technologies now minimize emissions. It'll do a different performance. It'll act differently during that day, and it'll reach this level of emissions per day. With that level of emissions, there's an associated cost. And with this better cost, there's an associated emissions. You could do something in between and say, you must stay at the midpoint of emissions. What's my associated cost? So this starts to paint the picture, which if you're a systems engineer out there, you've probably heard Pareto trade-off analyses or Pareto frontier. You want to try to find what is the relationship between one extreme and another. So in this case, I say minimize emissions. So if my emissions axis here, I want to be minimum. So at the bottom of it, that's this number with an associated cost. And then you could say minimize cost, which is on this axis, and I would go to the left and say minimize cost, but that has an associated emissions. So right here, you found that the minimum cost is more, minimum emissions is more costly than the minimum cost in emissions. And that starts to paint a picture of, as I move along this path, what is the trade-off? Is it a straight line, or is there some sort of relationship that might tell me maybe I should invest a little more or pay a little more money to get a larger benefit in carbon emissions? And this is known as the Pareto frontier. You have this feasible line, feasible region anywhere in here, but you wouldn't necessarily want to be anywhere in here because you could always do better by being on the line. But the infeasible region is the interesting part. And the fact that that exists when you look at these energy systems means that there is some dueling objective and some dueling relationship between cost and emissions. So now, hopefully, you're starting to see that if I can do this cost and emissions relationship with two cost emissions, can I do it with reliability as well? Or in my case, I was doing it with fuel efficiency. All that to say that you end up getting, instead of one plot, cost and emissions, you would have 3 plots linking emissions, cost, efficiency cost, and efficiency and emissions. So 3 different ways of looking at the trade-off in between these. Eco-economic would be emissions cost, techno-economic would be efficiency cost, and techno-ecologic would be efficiency emissions. This is, I'm not showing exact results for a Northeast city specifically sized. This is more of the method and the approach that I've been taking over the past year as I'm finishing my PhD. And hopefully there'll be some real results about a part of the city that we can do as a case study to say, what are these trade-offs? And as of now, we are seeing that just the very existence of some distance here in the frontier means that there is a trade-off among all of these, and hopefully understanding that an investment, a slight reduction in optimal cost is worth it for the amount of emissions you're getting would be the kind of conclusion that we're trying to get. So this is pretty much my whole method, and I am out of time, so I want to leave time for questions, but I'm happy to talk more about it with anyone if they have any direct questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. That's very interesting work, and I have so many things I would love to talk about. But let's go to some of the questions that are posted in the Q&A. So there is a question about the website that you mentioned, the one where I think you mentioned anybody can go and access this tool and use it. And the question is about a link, and I'm sure we can provide that offline. But I guess a variation of that is, so what do you need to possess to be able to use that? I mean, there is a lot of there is some data needed, and you talked about a lot of places where you can get the data. If I wanted to do this for some part of the Northeast versus the other, what do I need to go in there to make this tool usable for me? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's a frustrating reality where you have a lot of tools made by national labs, but there might be either plugins that are paid or limited ability to go in and edit some things. So in my case, I'll pull it up. In my case, I made it in a way that anyone can use the base tool. So that means that with just a Python open source library, as a student, Groovy is an optimizer that we use. Students can get it for free. So there's technically a restriction that a student would have to be using it, but there's a version that I'm putting up that has all open source Python. The point is you could select on this left pane and play around with preset numbers. So everything would run with the preset information. Now, if you wanted to put in your own city, that's honestly what people would want to do. Then it's a little more complicated. You'd have to upload your own CSV files, edit your own costs. And that's where I can start explaining as much as I can in like a README file, but it ends up being more work because you do have to go in, find your own numbers. And if you're putting in something incorrectly, I didn't build in any catches or any sort of filter to say, oh, that input will break the model. You can't put that in. That's probably a limit. I will say there's REOPT, which is a Department of Energy tool that essentially tries to do this and does it very well. So REOPT would be, and I see in the Q&A, I'll reach out to Lula. REOPT is, I think, a much more fleshed out tool that does the same analysis, but has different plugins that you could use and put in your information. So long way of saying that I made it a very base form that you could just use and see some things. But if you did want to make your own city in here, it would definitely involve some code tweaking and some data set tweaking.
That makes sense. Actually, we have some experience working with REOPT in a completely different context. We've been using it in a non-US developing world context, actually. So that was actually related to something I wanted to ask you before. When you started, the longer title of the talk itself is about the Northeast, and I completely understand why you want to focus on Northeast. Having spent some time in New York City myself, I think that there's a ton of motivation to focus on a place where you spend time in. But stepping that aside, I guess my question for you would be, do you have any advice for how these things can be, these ideas, these methods can be ported over to other parts of the world, even other parts of US or other countries, etc.? Because that's something that I've always wondered. You mentioned a lot of great data sets from DOE and NREL and many national labs. That's actually very true. I'm very I can totally see how beneficial that is. But most of those are related to the US context. So once you step outside, what advice do you have?
Yeah, another good point, good question. I think I'm lucky. Yeah, I'm lucky that the national labs, the organizations, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, even they have this research fund that is really trying to develop locally analyses, local tools. If you asked someone there, they'd probably say something along the lines of, the more we can develop here, the more they can trickle outward. I think that focusing on, yes, I have made this conclusion about a Northeast city, but can I leave behind all the Northeast mess to it and simply say, I have a framework, I have a methodology, I am detached from real parameters, real realities of a Northeast city, and I'm instead saying this 3D trade-off analysis between efficiency, cost, and emissions could be done by any energy system anywhere on Mars. Like, at that point, as an engineer, I like that process of staying away from the exact case study and just saying this way of thinking about it is probably beneficial or interesting insight that can form policy abroad. One of the things that I haven't got into, but it's a very clear progression, is something like a carbon tax. If you add a carbon tax, how does that alleviate the tension between the trade-offs? If you were to say, okay, yes, it worked in the Northeast, but I'm just saying in general, government incentives have this ability, then they could be read by another country, another city, another place with completely different realities of energy systems, but they can see that government incentives has a role to play in alleviating that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. One of the challenges we've been having in using Reopt is related to the limitations of the various plugins that are available. There's information, there's a lot of stuff available, but much of it is specific to only a few countries, etc.
Yeah.
One more thing that came to my mind as you were talking about this is, you do talk about reliability, which is a really important aspect of or a really important metric, performance metric for future systems. And that is necessarily stochastic. There's a probability element in there, but beyond that, even if let's say for a moment we ignore the reliability angle completely, let's simplify. Let's just focus on the inherent tension between cost and emissions, because it's a rich enough problem, in my opinion, to just look at cost and just the total cost and emissions, right? And you just talked about carbon credit, and that's definitely one way of smoothing or easing that tension. But maybe you can talk a little bit about ignoring the reliability angle. How do you model? And I know you presented your model at a very very accessible way, which I'm very grateful for, because I often face this dilemma of, okay, how much match do I want to show on a slide?
Yeah.
I thought you threaded the needle very well. So that's great. But a downside of that, obviously, is that you don't have time to talk about all the nitty-gritties. So, and I don't want to get into the depth of the mathematics, but maybe you can talk at a high level how you incorporate uncertainty into your models, because uncertainty seems like a very big deal above and beyond reliability.
Yes, that's a great question. So uncertainty in, for example, forecasted load is one that I often see. Uncertainty in renewable energy access, like how much sun you'll actually have the next day. That's a source of uncertainty. And then prices and emissions. You might think that tomorrow the price of natural gas or the price of the electricity will be that, but if these larger markets are plain, you'll have uncertainty there too. Depends on what level you're buying electricity, but that is a source of uncertainty. So in my experience, doing something like stochastic programming, which accounts for a possible variation in renewable energy and load and prices, will give you a result that kind of is conservative in some way. It is accounting for a possible uncertainty, and therefore it might play its cards a little more conservatively. That has been a whole study in and of itself that happened that I did kind of in parallel. But then when I came back to just the decision of adding or taking away technologies, I said, well, if I'm comparing apples to apples, if everyone feels the same uncertainty, then it's more about having these deterministic data sets that might represent an extreme year. And then I'm making my decisions with an extreme year data set, but everyone feels that all these scenarios would feel that extreme year. So I took the stochastic nature of this problem more to the way I provide data sets, and I just look at different extremes rather than, which is probably what you're wondering about, coding in or modeling in uncertainty to the decisions that are made.
Right. So you're not looking at like expected cost, for example. You're looking at something of a sort of scenario-based view of uncertainty. You might look at maybe various percentiles, maybe upper percentile.
Exactly.
To the point of being conservative.
That's exactly. It's like worst case scenario year, worst case. Like I'll find these, you get all the annual load, or really the historical loads, thanks to these resources. And you could say, let me look at 2003, because 2003 was ridiculous when it came to this. Similarly for solar, you have all these years, but one year maybe much more cloud coverage in the area. So that one had less solar output. Let me look at that one as well. So it ended up being more, scenario based rather than accounting for it internally. As an operational energy management system, it instead was more of an analysis tool looking at different data sets.
Makes sense. Yeah, yeah. It's just, there's so many complexities you can add on it, and there is always more complications to look at. And that leads me to another question that has been posted in the Q&A. I'm going to read the question. Clearly, the 3 dimensions is plenty, and to my point, maybe even 2 would be good enough. But can we maybe talk a little bit about the equity aspects of this? I'm pretty sure this is another one of those things that I mean, presumably you can create some kind of frontier on that if you had maybe time to do a PhD or something like that.
Right. Well, like, you and your many masters, I hear that I might do a systems engineering PhD after this. I have wanted to go deeper into equity. I think Molly is asking the question. Like, believe me, I hear all these things, and I hear that decisions made by a big utility in the sake of cost will have impacts on segments of the grid, segments of communities that will feel the pain later in health or in costs, burdens. Like, so I am very much aware of these realities. Unfortunately, for my modeling, it is not in it right now, and I would only see 1 or 2 outlets of where it is now that could start to come in equity, but definitely the bigger planning questions, the bigger cost affordability questions, as of now, it can't be answered. Yes, another PhD would definitely be appropriate for getting away from just the technical, electrical, and mechanical engineering and going into how these decisions are affecting over time. So if many different cities are choosing to be on this cost and emissions point, then the next year, do others have an easier time adopting those? So as of now, there isn't a direct connection. There is one that I notice, which is if you are a smaller district energy system. So an example would be if you have a small campus in a city rather than maybe a much bigger office complex. So maybe you have 11 buildings that you're managing with a central plant, or maybe you just have like 2 dorms, part of NYU, New York University or something. What I'm finding is that those smaller ones do have more penalties or more of a trade-off than the bigger ones. The bigger ones can get away with decisions having enough of X, Y, and Z for them to say, oh, we're saving emissions, and we're not jeopardizing a lot of cost. So it's coming out that the smaller ones, smaller energy systems for cities do have a tougher time making this decision. So I would say if I wanted to connect this to equity, I would try to reveal this information to Department of Energy, for example, and say, yes, you're doing your energy justice metrics to try to see which communities, which people should get help with their energy transition, but maybe you should add an aspect to campuses and like hospital campuses, university campuses, groups of buildings, because the smaller ones will have a similar kind of difference between the wealthier individuals versus the not so readily to transition individuals. So that's what I'm seeing that could be an aspect, but I hear your question, and as of now, there isn't a way of getting all these other really interesting questions answered.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that makes total sense. I think it's always valuable to think about the ways, sort of the best and worst possible ways this can affect any new framework can affect equity, even if you're not able to kind of fully characterize that. So I think your examples were very helpful, looking at the college dorm versus otherwise kind of setting.
Yeah, and I will say, Molly, I wonder if equity can be a configuration of the three, like clean, affordable, efficient. The reason I'm sticking with those is because I can peg exact metrics to them. Like there is a dollar amount that I can say for cost. There is a emission, like literal emission that's being emitted. And then there is a reliability probability that I can give it. As an electrical engineer, I almost have to stay in that realm of like actual metrics. So another way I've been thinking about it, like, yes, clean, affordable, efficient, and equitable, but maybe asking myself, is equity simply like a proper configuration of affordability, efficient, and clean? Like, and therefore we're equitable. Like if everyone is receiving that much of the Venn diagram, okay, we are providing equitable energy. I don't know. But that is something that's come across. Like, how would I put a number on equity? It would be difficult, but I hear you.
Yeah, one specific idea might be along what you just mentioned, one specific idea might be looking at, instead of total cost, or in addition to total cost, you could look at min-max cost, for example, right? So you minimize the maximum cost, maximum brunt borne by anybody. We've done some work in the past in different contexts where this kind of min-max or lexicographic, some people call it optimization methods, might be getting at least one flavor of equity that's somewhat agreeable among equity researchers. So that's just one thought. But we are getting very close to the end of this really fascinating conversation. I have really enjoyed listening to your talk, Ben. But before we let you go, do you have any last thoughts? Anything else you would like to say?
Yeah, definitely. A couple things. The first is energy modeling is very difficult. I didn't know going into this PhD what I was getting myself into. I believe it or not, I now am jealous of physics PhD students who can reduce everything into like one little experiment. As complicated as that experiment is and how difficult quantum is, like, yes, they at least have the ability to just like leave everything else behind and just look at a microscope and look at something very specific. When I have been doing this energy PhD, energy is interconnected, like Molly's question. Like, yes, equity is obviously popping in every day that I'm doing this. I don't think it pops into quantum engineers or quantum physicists as much. So I'd say for anyone trying to get into energy, because it's so interconnected and difficult and you'll have to make assumptions, I think leaning on existing tools, existing expertise, professors, national labs, abroad, locally, like I think that's a very good way of approaching it because there has been work done and really good tools exist. So trying to understand what the assumptions are there and what you could use that for is probably one of my recommendations for energy modeling or energy analyses in general. And then the last thing I'll say is about this New Energy Talk and the New Energy Summit, that it was a really good experience for me. Dartmouth is doing an amazing job. Megan and Amanda are doing an amazing job with that. So I'd recommend that to anyone who sees this and thinks that they're doing a technical PhD. I think that a technical PhD is complemented really well by the kind of things that Amanda and Megan are doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
All right, well, thank you so much, Vikram, for moderating a really great discussion. And thank you so much, Ben, for being here and for the New Energy plug. Thank you. It's great. But yeah, we really appreciate you coming here and giving us an update on your work and sharing your approach to this really big and complicated, but important question in energy transition. So thank you so much for that. It's really great to have you. And again, to Vikram for moderating a really fabulous discussion. So before we close, I'm just gonna give you a little update on what we have coming up next for for our events. So again, Ben did my job for me, which was wonderful. But we do have our no, thank you. It's great to hear from an actual alumni of the New Energy Summit. So thank you so much for that. We do have our 3rd annual New Energy Summer Summit coming up, and applications are open now. That will be held in July. And for accepted applicants, this is a fully funded opportunity. So you'll receive funding for travel and for accommodations. And so the applications are due March 15th. There's a QR code up here, but you can also feel free to reach out to me or to look on our website for more information on that. And that's open to advanced PhD students, postdoctoral scholars, and assistant professors from any discipline. The only requirement is really that you are working in a field that intersects with climate and energy. And we are done with our winter session of the New Energy series, but we have our first speaker for the spring will be on April 3rd. Maddie Crew is a Dartmouth alum, and she will be here visiting us online from Clark University, talking about how to kill a power line, utility on utility violence, and electricity, capital, and energy infrastructure disputes. So we're looking forward to that talk and hope you can join us for that. And thank you again to Ben, and thank you to Vikram for being here, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you.